as we begin the new tractate of Sukkah, we need a few more psukim. One which the Gemara will eventually use is from Devarim, from the Parsha of Ra'eh. Chag HaSukkot taseh lecha shivat yamim. You shall hold the feast of Sukkot for 7 days. And the short-term nature of Sukkot is going to be incredibly important. It's a temporary festival. And that's reinforced in the psukim from the Parsha of Emor, which the Gemara is going to use much more heavily, is going to rely on much more heavily. And maybe it's worth just reading over those psukim from Emor. Basukot teshavu shivat yamim. You shall live in booths or in Sukkot for 7 days. Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshavu basukot. Every citizen of Israel should dwell in a booth. There's something which is peculiarly time limited about Sukkot and about the Sukkah. But there's also something about consciousness. L'ma'an yeda'u dorotechem, in order that your generations may know, ki v'Sukkot v'shavti et b'nei Yisrael b'hotzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, in order that your generations should know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths in Sukkot when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. There's something about temporariness and there's something about cognition, about knowledge in these psukim. And we'll see in a minute that the Gemara will use these two concepts. There's a third pasuk as well, which we're going to need, and it's from Isaiah. And he's described, this is an apocalyptic vision of Jerusalem, but in that vision he says, Vesukah tiyel etzel yomam mechorev. There shall be a sukkah for daily shade from the heat, u le machse, and for a refuge, u le mistor mizerem u mi matar, and for a place of shelter from storm and from rain. So that the sukkah has got these three aspects. It's temporary, it only lasts for 7 days. There's something about cognition. We need to understand that it's a sukkah and it's a place of refuge. These are the three aspects which the Gemara at the beginning of sukkah is going to draw on. And the Mishnah begins, Sukkah shehi gvoha lemala mi'esrim Amar psula. A sukkah which is more than 20 cubits high is invalid. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda machshir, he says it's kasher, and the halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara explains that a sukkah which is more than 20 cubits high, 20 cubits, that's about 10 meters, that's 30 feet. I think of a story of a building is about 3 yards. So this is a sukkah which is as high as a 3-story building. If we build a sukkah as high as a 3-story building, it's not kasher. One reason, by the way, which is brought by the Jerusalem Talmud, is that the rabbis learned this out from the door of the sanctuary, that the door of the Kodesh Kedoshim was 20 amot high. We're not going to build a sukkah which is higher than the door of the sanctuary. So that's one idea, but that's in the Jerusalem Talmud. But in the Babylonian Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud speaks along the following lines, that a sukkah which is more than 20 cubits high isn't a temporary structure anymore. And we need to understand that, we need to understand that Sukkot is temporary. Maybe there's even a bigger message than that. Maybe we need to understand that we're on a journey, that life is temporary. There's something about Sukkot which has to be temporary. But there's also something about cognition. The Gemara suggests that if you're in a sukkah more than 20 cubits high, you're not aware of the thing at the top that's shading you. You're not aware you're in a sukkah. You could be anywhere, right? If you're in a structure 20 cubits high, you could be anywhere. You've got no sense that you're actually sitting in a sukkah. And then the third, and and that speaks to the pasuk Leman yedu dorotechem. You're sitting in Sukkot because your generations shall know. The cognition of being in a sukkah is absolutely vital. And then the third reason that the Gemara brings for a sukkah being less than 20 amot is that perhaps if it's so high, if it's more than 20 amot, you're not sitting in the shade of the roof anymore. You're sitting in the shade of the sides. And we're going to learn, as we learn the Mishnah of Sukkah, that the composition of the roof is absolutely critical. What makes a sukkah is the roof. And we need to be in the shade of the roof. If we don't, as Isaiah says, the sukkah is a shade from the heat, and it's a refuge, it's a place of shelter from storm and from rain. If we don't have a sense of a sukkah as a shelter, then we're not fulfilling the mitzvah. So for all these reasons, a sukkah, which is more than 20 cubits high, more than 20 amot high, is invalid. And there are equivalent restrictions at the opposite end of the size spectrum. So she'ena gavoha asarat tefachim, if it's not 10 hands breadths high, that's about 30 inches. If it's lower than 30 inches. Ve'she'ein la shalosh tefanot, if it doesn't have 3 walls. If its sun is greater than its shade, psula, it's invalid. It has to be a real space. It has to be a real space, more than minimal size, and it has to have shade. So if it has more sun than shade, it's invalid. What about a sukkah that hasn't been put up for the purpose of Sukkot? Sukkah yishana. An old sukkah. In other words, we got a building hanging around somewhere, and we say, look, could we use it as a sukkah? Beit Shammai poslin, Beit Shammai invalidated. Interestingly, Beit Hillel machshirin. Beit Hillel says it's kasher. Now, what do we mean by an old sukkah? Well, the Mishnah says, Ve'ezehi sukkah yishna. What do we mean by an old sukkah? Kol she'asa'a kodem l'chag shloshim yom. Anything that was made more than 30 days before the festival is presumed to be made for some other purpose. It hasn't been made for the festival. Although, and the Mishnah will qualify now, if it was deliberately made for the purpose of the festival, even from the beginning of the year, it's valid. Someone who makes his sukkah under a tree, it's as if he made it within the house. We're coming back here to the question of shade. The sukkah has to provide the shelter from the rain. If the sukkah is just sitting under a tree, it's almost as if the sukkah is sitting under a house. It's not that the shade is being provided by the tree, not by the sukkah. And we've learned that the sukkah has to provide the shade. So we can't make a sukkah under a tree, or for that matter, under a house. Sukkah al gabei sukkah. What about a sukkah on top of a sukkah? This is a weird idea, but if we can imagine a town where the houses are very closely packed, were building houses around courtyards. Maybe there's only enough room in the courtyard for one sukkah. We could think about building another sukkah on top of the first sukkah in the courtyard. Sukkah gabei sukkah ha'elyona kshera v'tachtuna psula. The top one is kosher because the top one has a real roof. V'tachtuna psula. The bottom one is invalid because, well, the bottom one is under a sukkah. The bottom one is not on. The bottom one is it's as if it's under a tree or under a house. The bottom one, if it's under a sukkah, it doesn't have a roof open to the sky. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im ein diorin be'elyona tachtuna kshera. Rabbi Yehuda says, actually, if there are no occupants in the other one, the lower one is valid. But I don't think the halacha will follow Rabbi Yehuda. What about if we put up a sort of a tent inside the sukkah? Peras aleha sadim mipnei hachama. Actually, here we're going to put a tent over it. So we spread a sheet over it in order to keep the sun off it. In Bavel, and for that matter in Eretz Yisrael, the sun is much more of a problem around Sukkot time than the rain. When we're in Washington, or in England, we think about the rain as the problem with Sukkot. Whereas if you spent time in Jerusalem, you know actually sun is the problem. So someone spread a sheet over it because of the sun. And we can already feel this is going to be pasul because the sheet is providing the shade rather than the sukkah. And the principle, and we learned this from the verses in Isaiah, the sukkah has to provide the shade. Or maybe we put the sheet below the schaf. Peras, we put the sheet we put the sheet below the roof of the sukkah just to keep away the falling leaves. Or shipiras al gabei hakinof. Maybe we've got a four-poster bed in the sukkah because the halacha is that we're going to sleep in the sukkah. We're going to live in the sukkah. So we could spread this sheet over a four-poster bed and create some kind of a tent, if you like, inside the sukkah. And in all of these cases, the halacha is psula. Aval poresu al gabei klitei hamita. Aval pores hu al gabei klitei hamita. But one does spread you can spread out the cloth over the crossbar of a two-post bed. So if we can imagine a bed with a vertical post at the head and a vertical post at the foot, and then there's a horizontal going from the head to the foot. And then we spread this sheet over. It must look a bit like a bed in a Shakespeare play. It's got this sheet in the, a bit like a teepee hanging down over the bed. So that I guess the sheet doesn't look like a flat roof. The sheet looks like a slanting roof. And the conclusion there is that, well, we're allowed to do it. Aval poresu, someone is allowed to spread the sheet over the crossbar in that way, and it does not invalidate the sukkah as a whole.